The Cambodian-Vietnamese War was an armed conflict between the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and Democratic Kampuchea. The war began with isolated clashes along the land and maritime boundaries of Vietnam and Kampuchea between 1975 and 1977, occasionally involving division-sized military formations. On 25 December 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Kampuchea and subsequently occupied the country and removed the Khmer Rouge government from power. During the Vietnam War, Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge communists had formed an alliance to fight US-backed regimes in their respective countries. Despite their open display of cooperation with the Vietnamese, the Khmer Rouge leadership feared that the Vietnamese communists were scheming to form an Indo-Chinese federation with Vietnam as the dominant force in the region, in order to preempt an attempt by the Vietnamese to dominate them. The Khmer Rouge leadership began purging Vietnamese trained personnel within their own ranks as the Lon Nol regime capitulated in 1975. Then, in May 1975, the newly formed Democratic Kampuchea, dominated by the Khmer Rouge, began waging a war against Vietnam, which was marked by an attack on the Vietnamese island of Phu Quoc. In spite of the fighting that had occurred between the two countries, the leaders of reunified Vietnam and Kampuchea made several public diplomatic exchanges throughout 1976 to highlight the supposedly strong relations between them. However, behind the scenes, Kampuchean leaders continued to fear what they perceived as Vietnamese expansionism. As such, on 30 April 1977, they launched another major military attack on Vietnam. Shocked by the Kampuchean assault, Vietnam launched a retaliatory strike at the end of 1977 in an attempt to force the Kampuchean government to negotiate. In January 1978, the Vietnamese military withdrew because their political objectives had not been achieved. Small-scale fighting continued between the two countries throughout 1978, as China tried to mediate peace talks between the two sides. However, neither country could reach an acceptable compromise at the negotiation table. By the end of 1978, Vietnamese leaders decided to remove the Khmer Rouge-dominated regime of Democratic Kampuchea, perceiving it as being pro-Chinese and too hostile towards Vietnam. On 25 December 1978, 150,000 Vietnamese troops invaded Democratic Kampuchea and overran the Kampuchean Revolutionary Army in just 2 weeks. On 8 January 1979, a pro-Vietnamese People's Republic of Kampuchea was established in Phnom Penh, marking the beginning of a 10-year Vietnamese occupation. During that period, the Khmer Rouge's Democratic Kampuchea continued to be recognized by the United Nations as the legitimate government of Kampuchea, as several armed resistance groups were formed to fight the Vietnamese occupation. Behind the scenes, Prime Minister Hun Sen of the Park regime approached factions of the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea to begin peace talks, under heavy diplomatic and economic pressure from the international community. At the third Jakarta informal meeting in 1990, under the Australian-sponsored Cambodian peace plan, representatives of the CGDK and the PARC agreed to a power-sharing arrangement by forming a unity government known as the Supreme National Council. The SNC's role was to represent Cambodian sovereignty on the international stage, while the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia was tasked with supervising the country's domestic policies until a Cambodian government was elected by the people through a peaceful, democratic process. Cambodia's pathway to peace proved to be difficult, as Khmer Rouge leaders decided not to participate in the general elections, but instead they chose to disrupt the electoral process by launching military attacks on UN peacekeepers and killing ethnic Vietnamese migrants. In May 1993, Sihanouk's FUNCINPEC movement defeated the Cambodian People's Party, formerly the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party, to win the general elections. However, the CPP leadership refused to accept defeat and they announced that the eastern provinces of Cambodia, where most of the CPP's votes were drawn from, would secede from Cambodia. To avoid such an outcome, Norodom Ranariddh, the leader of FUNCINPEC, agreed to form a coalition government with the CPP. Shortly afterwards, the constitutional monarchy was restored and the Khmer Rouge was outlawed by the newly formed Cambodian government. Etymology. In Vietnam, the war is called the Campaign of Counter-Invasion at Vietnam's national southwest border, Chen Dik Phan Cong Bien Gua Te Nam Vietnam. Background. Cambodian Vietnamese history. Angkor, the seat of the Khmer Empire, was subjected to Vietnamese influence as early as the 13th century. Vietnamese influence spread gradually and indirectly, and it was not until the early 19th century that Vietnam exercised direct control. In 1813, Nak Ong Chan gained the Cambodian throne with the help of Vietnam, and under his rule Cambodia became a protectorate. Following his death in 1834, Vietnam colonized Cambodia. It was governed under a Vietnamese administration and termed a Vietnamese province. Throughout the 1830s, Vietnam attempted to erase Khmer culture, which had derived the basis of Cambodian society, dress and religion from India rather than China. The trend of Vietnamese dominance continued during French colonization, under which Cambodia was forced to cede much of its southern coast to the Vietnamese. The Khmer Rouge later justified their incursions into Vietnam as an attempt to regain the territories which Cambodia lost during the previous centuries. Rise of communism. The communist movement in Cambodia and Vietnam began before World War II with the founding of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, almost exclusively dominated by the Vietnamese, originally meant to fight French colonial rule in Indochina. In 1941, Nguyen Ai Quoc founded the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, or the Viet Minh. When the Japanese were defeated at the end of World War II, he initiated the First Indo-Chinese War of Independence against the French. During this time, Vietnamese forces made extensive use of Cambodian territory to transport weapons, supplies, and troops. This relationship lasted throughout the Vietnam War, when Vietnamese communists used Cambodia as a transport route and staging area for attacks on South Vietnam. In 1951, Vietnam guided the establishment of a separate Cambodian Communist Party, the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party, which allied with the nationalist separatist Cambodian movement, the Khmer Serre, in order to pursue independence. In accordance with the 1954 Geneva Accords negotiating the end of the French domination, newly created Communist North Vietnam pulled all of its Viet Minh soldiers and cadres out of Cambodia. However, since the KPRP was staffed primarily by ethnic Vietnamese or Cambodians under its tutelage, approximately 5,000 communist cadres went with them. The power vacuum the Vietnamese communists left in its wake in Cambodia was soon filled by the return of a young group of Cambodian communist revolutionaries, many of whom received their communist education in France. In 1960, the KPRP changed its name to the Kampuchean Communist Party, and the name was later adopted by the majority coalition that formed around Saloth Sa, Ieng Sari and Xufanc as the true political institution memorializing the KCP. This clique became the genesis of the Khmer Rouge, and its doctrine was heavily influenced by the Maoist ideology. Democratic Kampuchea and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge government adopted the mysterious term Angkar, or the organization, and, until 1977, the identities of its leaders remained confidential. The official head of state was Xufanc, but the two men in control of the party were Pol Pot and Ieng Sari. The ultimate objective of the Khmer Rouge was to erase the structure of the Cambodian state, which they viewed as feudal, capitalist, and oriented around the agendas of both the landholding elite and imperialists. In its place, they hoped to create a classless society based entirely on worker peasants. The radical ideologies and goals of the Khmer Rouge were alien concepts to the masses. In fact, the socialist revolution held very little popular appeal, which led Pol Pot and his cadres to use ultra-nationalist sentiment, repressive and murderous rule and propaganda aimed at demonizing the Vietnamese to maintain their tenuous control. During the 5 years of the Khmer Rouge Rebellion from 1970 to 1975, the support of North Vietnam, in conjunction with China, was essential to its eventual triumph. However, even before the Vietnam War ended, the relationship between the Khmer Rouge, which was in the process of seizing power from a US-backed regime headed by Lon Nol, and Vietnam was strained. Clashes between Vietnamese communists and Khmer Rouge forces began as early as 1974, and the following year Pol Pot signed a treaty codifying the friendship between the Khmer Rouge and China.